who keeps putting piles of bones on porches by dead pallet.
November 5th, 1940. On the front doorstep of a small ranch house in Dinosaur, Colorado, a neat pile of bones was discovered by Cleveland Barthmore, a local locksmith, when he went outside for his morning paper. He was eager to see any news on the day's election, any indication of what would come in the race between Indiana Republican Wendell Willkie and incumbent New York Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt. Instead, he found a perfectly white human skeleton, arranged in a mound, crowned with a skull, tilted up, just slightly, to meet his eyes. Mr. Barthmore thought it was some sort of joke with just how clean and white the bones were. Perhaps it was somehow related to the election at hand. It struck him as comical at first, but upon consulting with his wife, Joanne, she pressured him into contacting the local police to investigate what appeared to be a prank. Joanne didn't think it was a laughing matter, nor did the police. Police forensic units determined that the pile contained human bones, and judging by the shape and size, they were the bones of a young woman. What wasn't determined was the method of death, or the origin of the bones. Forensics was also confused as to why the pile contained 2 right pisiform bones. This is a tiny bone found where the base of your palm meets your wrist, on the pinky side. If this was some kind of prank, this was an odd little oversight. However, no proof of murder had been committed, just the crime of epically pranking someone with illegal human skeletons. It would seem the story ended there, until another blip of information appeared exactly 4 years later. November 7th, 1944. Roosevelt was just about to earn his unprecedented 4th term when a woman, who chose to remain anonymous, found a pile of bones on her front porch in Ashland, Wisconsin. Again, she, much like Barthmore 4 years prior, thought it was a joke of some kind. To be on the safe side, she reported the finding to local police. That, and she didn't want to touch the bones either. Response time was slow that day, but when an officer did arrive, a few photos were taken and the evidence collected without much fanfare. The world was still in the grips of war, and the United States wrapped up in the election, and little mind was paid to this curious case. Curious as it may be. At the time, no connection between the Ashland case and the dinosaur case was drawn. Both were barely talked about locally. But later, it was discovered that the body was, again, that of a young woman's. And again, there was one extra bone. An extra right talus bone. Both were identical in every way. Entirely indistinguishable. This, of course, leads us to November 2nd, 1948, as I'm sure many of you could predict. The location this time was a little mansion in Harvey, Louisiana, where a pile of bones, just like the first 2, was found. Gertrude Bowman phoned the police when she first exited her house at approximately 2:15 p.m., on her way to the local butcher. She and her husband, James Bowman, were the wealthy business owners of several cafes, and publicly campaigned for controversial third-party candidate Strom Thurmond. Unlike the previous 2 households of interest, Mrs. Bowman did not find the pile of bones at all comedic. The Bowmans used their power and influence in the Dixiecrat state of Louisiana to push the investigation hard. This is finally where all 3 cases were linked. The pile of bones this time were not only measured for size and shape, but bone density as well. The conclusion was again that these were the bones of a young woman. The out-of-place extra bone was easier to spot this time, with it being an exact copy of the left humerus. The Dinosaur, Colorado and Harvey, Louisiana cases were both published in local newspapers the next day, but that was the entirety of the coverage. The Ashland case wasn't even mentioned in any local newspapers at all, just being talked about around town. Despite the Bowmans pushing for a bigger investigation, nothing came of it. Technically, owning human remains outside of ashes is illegal, and placing them into another's possession obviously is. But outside of that, there was still no hard proof of murder. The indication that the bones were all from young women suggests unnatural deaths, but again, there were no signs of trauma on the bones. Authorities agreed there is nothing they could do but wait. The morning was Tuesday, November 4th, 1952, and later that day, Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower, from the great state of New York, would end the 20-year winning streak for the Democrats in the Oval Office. But that morning, Lawrence Yandy, car mechanic, would find the ceremonial pile of bones on his front step in Snowflake, Arizona. You know how the story goes from here. Or do you? Investigation found a slight break in the pattern. They indeed found an extra bone, this time vomer bone, which is found in the nasal opening. But the forensics team believed these bones to belong to a young man, rather than a woman. Once the connection was drawn between this case and the others, Snowflake's presiding coroner, Roger Powell, was asked to reassess his conclusions. The verdict remained unchanged. These bones were a man's. Several FBI specialists were called in to verify Mr. Powell's judgment. Verify they did. Here we find ourselves at November 6th, 1956, which came and went without another speck of information. Nothing was reported to the authorities, and this case, while known by the FBI, wasn't of grand importance, outside of how strange it was. Whether or not another pile of bones was placed is unknown. There is a range of possibilities. Perhaps the bones were seen as a joke and tossed into the trash, the finder believing them to be fake. Perhaps the finder didn't want to involve the police for fear of being a suspect. Perhaps the finder fancied the bones and kept them as a house decoration. Or maybe the old ritual just came to an end. But we know now that it didn't. November 8th, 1960 was the day that the Democratic hopeful, John F. Kennedy, was elected president. In Newport, Vermont, another anonymous citizen found a pile of bones on their porch. Only there was an extra right clavicle. Curiosity was spurred further when the bones were that of a woman's. That made the Snowflake case the only one where the remains could be attributed to a man rather than a woman. November 3rd, 1964, JFK's running mate Lyndon B. Johnson dominated Republican Barry Goldwater. And in Omaha, Nebraska, a pile of bones was discovered with 2 left patella bones belonging to a woman. November 5th, 1968, Republican Richard Nixon wins the vote in a 3-horse race against Hubert Humphrey and George Wallace. That morning, in Trinity, California, a pile of bones was discovered, including an extra occipital bone, all belonging to a deceased man, and that complicated matters. The Snowflake case was no longer alone as the sole male skeleton. And from then until now, a pattern continues. Years are missed here and there, but this has been happening for at least 80 years. It's very doubtful that it's been done by one person, considering the time span and scope of the ritual, as I've called it. Maybe you've figured out the odd quirk to this pattern. See, it seems whenever the bones are that of a woman's, a Democrat wins the presidency. And when a man's bones are found, a Republican. The person or people placing these bones are either predicting the outcome of the election, already know the outcome of the election, or are changing it with the ritual. No matter the method, someone or a group of someones is pulling the strings. As for the reason for the extra bones, or how they're identical to the other bone in the skeleton, I've got no clue. Neither do authorities, it seems. This story is always overshadowed by the most important election in the world. But I'm beginning to think that election is for show. Fun fact though, there are 206 bones in the human body. If we stay on course with this system of election every 4 years, we'll have a complete extra skeleton with mismatched bones in about 2764. Maybe we'll get some answers then.
Who Keeps Putting Piles of Bones on Porches was written by Dead Palette. Narration by Emma Lohman. Editing, mastering, and original music by Abysme. Comprehensive links below. YouTube.com/Creepypasta is a collaborative channel. Please subscribe if you want to follow our content. If you want to support the channel, please consider liking, commenting, and sharing this video with like-minded members of the community.